Good evening, everybody. Sonoma State University sits on the borderlands of the Southern Pomo and Coast Miwok nations, the descendants of whom today are the enrolled citizens of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria. The mission of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria is social justice and environmental stewardship. The tribe hopes and encourages the larger community to join them in this necessary mission. Tonight, on behalf of Sonoma State University Alumni Association and University Advancement, we're excited to welcome you to our panel discussion, It Matters. I'm Mario Perez. I'm the Vice President for University Advancement, and we're excited to see so many of you here tonight. At Sonoma State, we're fortunate to have many experts, a great panelist that we have here tonight. Experts on recent domestic and geopolitical events that we're excited to have them here engaging in a lively discussion, in a very timely discussion. Before we begin tonight's program, I wanted to cover a few logistical items. For our guests who are here with us tonight, you should have seen a card on your chair with a pen as you sat down, and if you have any questions, please fill out the card with your question and submit it into the basket over to your left, and you can do that at any time. That's where the questions will be fielded from. Those of you joining us on Zoom, please submit your questions via chat, and we'll be moderating the chat for those as well. As a reminder, tonight's program is being recorded, so make sure you smile. At this time, I'm excited to introduce tonight's moderator. Many of you know him, Dr. Rob Eiler. Dr. Eiler is a professor of economics, where he has been teaching since 1995. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Davis in 1998 and earned a Bachelor's of Economics at CSU Chico in 1992. Dr. Eiler is the author of 2 books and several academic articles concerning economic sanctions, the economics of the wine industry, and monetary economics. He is often called by media as an expert in the field and has acted as an expert witness in interstate trade litigation and as a forensic economist. Dr. Eiler has been a visiting scholar at both the University of Bologna and Stanford University. He is a native of Sonoma County and one of our very own. His family has been here in Marin County since 1910 as sheep and cattle ranchers. Rob, I'd like to thank you for your partnership in tonight's evening. I'd like to thank the panel for joining us, and Dr. Eiler will introduce the panel. Let's get started.
Thank you, Mario. So folks, before we get started, I'm going to run through just a few items with you. You should see a slide that says agenda on it. So where we're going tonight is we're going to do our welcome and introductions. I'm going to introduce the panel in just a second and have them provide very brief biographies of themselves. We're going to have some opening statements. Each one of our panelists is going to talk from their research lens, how they're seeing certain topics as a way of just getting the conversation started. We had some questions come in from the registrants pre-event. We're going to ask some of those questions while you are putting questions together and giving it to our team, and then that'll come up to me. I will filter those questions and see how many match the questions that we had come in from the previous group, and then ask the questions as we have time, and I'll get back to that in just a second. And then at the end, we're going to have a lightning round question and try to just get some thoughts about what's going to happen on the other side of November 5 across the board from these experts' eyes, and then we're going to close. Now, I want to do a quick preamble. So our experts are providing expert opinions based on their research and the way that they see the world through their discipline. So think about that in terms of what they're saying and some of the answers to the questions you're going to hear. The questions are coming through me, and so there will not be, let's say, a roving mic or somebody else that will be making the questions happen. It'll just be me. And if you're on Zoom, you will be on mute, but please ask those questions in the chat, and we will integrate that with the other group of questions that we have. And if you have any comments please submit them via the paper that Mario described that should be on your seat or should have been there when you sat down. That's the way we're going to sort of just keep a balance in logistics through the questions here tonight. Now, as a general rule book, we have some First Amendment things happening downstairs, which is great. In here, please do not shout out your opinions or statements or questions. Use those cards and let's go through that filter so everybody has a chance to have their time when they have a question asked. And do not disrupt the speakers, please. The reason why we're gathered, folks, is twofold. So I'm also acting, and Mario didn't say this, but I'll say it because it's relatively new. I'm acting as what we call a special advisor to the university president's office. And part of why we're assembled here tonight was my thinking we needed to do three things. One, we need to learn from experts on this campus on certain topics. So these experts you're going to find are on the frontier of what they're doing in terms of research. We wanted to take a social science, history, political science approach to what's been happening in terms of the media blitz that you're getting. And I don't know how many people in here, I don't even know if I want to take a raise of hands, but if you are watching your phone constantly for the latest news about elections from the presidential election on down to what's happening in Rohnert Park, you are not alone, right? So just from a psychological standpoint, right, you are not alone in that journey. But there is a filtering mechanism you should be thinking about in certain ways that some people do and some people don't. So at my house, for example, my wife is sunk deep into what's going on, and I'm trying to act as kind of a counselor at home on those issues some nights. But what these three experts are going to tell us is their viewpoint and how to see it as a scientist. And I felt that that's a good way of showcasing the talent we have on this campus and the ways that we can help the community and really bringing y'all as number three to campus for these kind of events. So with that, like I said, and Mario introduced me. Thank you, Mario, for that introduction. My name is Rob Eiler. I'm a professor here in economics. I'm the moderator tonight. I'm not necessarily providing any expertise, depending on how you see that from me. But as a special advisor to the president, we're trying to do more of these type of things with you. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers, and I'm going to have each one of them, starting with Amy, kind of give a brief bio of themselves, and then we'll get into it with Amy with Emily, and then we're going to move to Emily's left. And then we will get into what they have as initial comments on their viewpoints vis-a-vis their research. Emily, please.
All right, thank you all. Am I audible?
You should be.
No.
But you want to get a little closer to the mic.
Is this audible? Okay. Clearly, I'm not a microphone expert, so working on that. Okay. Okay. Am I amplified? Great, thanks. For better or worse, I'm amplified now. Great. Thank you all for joining us. I'm a professor in the political science department with my colleague, Dr. McEwen. And I do the political theory end of the discipline. And my research is mostly looking at climate change, not so much exclusively from policy, but looking at the ways policies interact with ideology and how we orient ourselves in our relationship with the planet. So I've been looking at doomsday prepping and doomsday planning, bunkering as one of the responses to the anxieties around climate change. So I have a book coming out at the end of the year on that. That's been consuming my academic docket. And I teach outer space politics, political ideologies, environmental political theory here on campus.
Great. I want to just say, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Eiler, and everybody else involved in arranging this panel. It's a real privilege to be on an interdisciplinary panel, and I really want to stress that. I like political science. I respect what political scientists have to say. I want to know what they think, and I am not one. I am a historian. I am trained in the past, in understanding the present as the product of the past. And if you ever hear that I've been forced to teach a political science class, you will know that there has been a grave abrogation of the university's responsibility to uphold disciplinarity and professionalism, which is at the heart of what we do educationally. Okay, so as a historian, I specialize in the history of ideas. I'm interested in what people thought in the past, what they believed was true, what they valued, even when those values are at odds with mine. I try to leave my present behind when I go into the past and to see past circumstances from the perspective of the actors who lived through them. My first book, The Religion of Democracy, studies the history of democratic ideas from the 1700s until the 20th century, and the evolution of thought where people started to think of one another as equals who deserved to be free, a necessary predicate for the foundation of our democracy. I teach courses in history that cover from 1600 to the present. I specialize, like I said, in thought and culture, also in African-American thought and culture. My current book project is an intellectual history of the great writer James Baldwin.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is David McEwen. Thank you all for taking time, especially given events of politics day to day. Appreciate you being here. I'm a Sonoma State alum. So, yeah, I wish my father had bought property when I started as a student here, because there was nothing around the campus. My areas are American politics, particularly elections, international relations, particularly terrorism. I do study in two areas: political violence. So I teach those types of courses in off years. And then in on years, like election year, I teach courses around what's happening. And I really concentrate on ballot measures, the politics of ballot measures. There are over 160 ballot measures on the ballot nationwide, the most we've ever seen since 2018. And ballot measures, you see the ads, and they move the needle. They increase voter participation about 5 or 6 points, which can be hugely important in an election that's closely contested. You have abortion on the ballot in 11 states, for example, big deal, but also criminal justice, marijuana, political reform measures, tells, what are called tax expenditure limitations. And there are over 10,000 local measures on the ballot nationwide, like Measure J. And as a result, it's full employment between now and after the election. So I'm also really thankful for some great colleagues. I went to a book launch party for Kit when her book came out that C-SPAN covered down in San Francisco, and she rocked the place. That was way cool. And I was on Emily Ray's hiring committee. So I am thrilled to be on stage with these great scholars. And Rob and I do stuff all the time. He sells the sizzle of economics, if that's a thing, and I sell the sizzle of politics. So again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, folks, for introducing yourselves. David sells more steak than I do. So you might have sizzle, but you get more steak. So what I want to do real quick, though, is I want to thank you all again for coming like they did. It's great that you made the time. If you are an elected official or a staff member for an elected official, please stand up and be recognized. Thank you. How many of y'all are alums? Stand up and be recognized. Thank you. David, you were supposed to get up too. Okay. So folks, thank you for all that. We are recording this tonight, so this will live on, and our IT team's doing a great job there. Thank you so much for doing that. What I want to do is I want to hand it off to Emily to talk about what she's doing from a research standpoint and some of the things she's thinking about in terms of what we're looking at for November 5.
Great, thank you. There we go. I think we're getting the hang of it now. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the stakes of outer space that I think is actually under-discussed in most election cycles, if you don't mind switching to the next slide. Thank you. So some of the things I'm curious about is how our candidates take positions on outer space. And first, why do we care? Well, outer space is an issue of international relations. So our relationships with other spacefaring nations is really important, both as allies and as supposed foes. So the US is in competition with China, for example, who is going to establish the first lunar colony and the first lunar base. And the US is pretty preoccupied that China has successfully gotten a rover to the dark side of the moon, which might hold a lot of economic and strategic importance. Outer space is also where a lot of our communications takes place. Our GPS, if we didn't have our satellites in outer space, we would be in huge trouble. So basically outer space and underwater is where our communication passes through. And we have people like Elon Musk dumping satellites through Starlink. That's creating space debris, and space debris, if it's unchecked, will eventually enclose the planet and make space travel impossible. So we have to talk about the regulation and who has access to space. And outer space is part of how we address ourselves to pending climate catastrophe or current climate catastrophe. So a lot of our kind of space entrepreneurs are very eager to establish not just lunar presence, but Martian presence. or kind of a long-term presence in the void of space, which is Bezos's idea. Correction. That is Gerard O'Neill's idea, which comes out of science fiction, which Bezos is claiming is his idea. So we'll be a little more clear about the genealogy in the Nietzschean sense. We'll do that later. And so what I'm curious is how candidates actually talk about or don't talk about these pressing issues. So we can do the next slide, please, to the extent I can see it. So here are a couple of points about how the candidates that we have, Harris and Trump, have positions on outer space. And I absolutely implore you to take a look at some of their respective track records on outer space. They're actually not so distinct from each other as we might find them on other issues. So Trump resurrected the National Space Council, which had been more or less defunct since the early 90s. And Pence was the appointed sitting representative for the council. And they put a lot of energy into reestablishing the goals of putting human astronauts back on the moon. Again, this is part of an effort to make a demonstration to other international space agencies what the U.S. is capable of. Pence has also been preoccupied or was preoccupied with making motions about China. He discussed the quote unquote red flag of communism that China was planting on the moon. So we're also bringing back like 1950s era space race language. And Trump also established Space Force, which is kind of a branch of the Air Force. NASA funding doesn't go to it, but it is establishing outer space as a potential theater of war, even though that contravenes the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is meant to prevent all nations from using outer space as a theater of war. Harris has largely, she's stepped into the role that Pence occupies. So we're kind of learning about her space policies through her work as vice president rather than through her candidacy statements. She has largely continued the Trump era programs. One of her contributions has been to call for a ban on some anti-satellite testing, which essentially requires blowing up a country's own satellites to test weapons capacities. Again, this is a real dangerous stance with the Outer Space Treaty that is supposed to be banning this kind of activity. And she's part of kind of leading the charge to ban this, which was going to contribute to this space debris problem. And whoever is going to be president is going to be presiding over not just how NASA's budgetary priorities are established, which are a very small budget, but it still is enormous impact. They're going to be making decisions about if we should become spacefaring in terms of missions to Mars and what that looks like and what our national goals are. And they're going to be presiding over the end of the International Space Station. Russia is pulling out. It's going to be brought down to Earth in a dramatic crash in the ocean. And it's kind of an open question about what countries are going to do. That's not just ending an international space relationship that was established in the 90s, but that could restructure the way we have international agreements, friendly agreements with countries we have unfriendly agreements with in other parts of international relations. So I hope that covers some of the stakes of space politics, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Emily. And folks, on those questions, if you have a question, you write it down, just go like this, and our team will come by and grab that question from you. Thank you. Amy. So Amy's going to talk about the election and historic significance.
So I imagine I'm not the only person here who considers the historian Heather Cox Richardson to be a national treasure. Is that right? Yeah. She does a great job putting the present within the context of the past. And my approach, of course, is different from hers, but I just wanted to bring her up to underline the significance of her argument in not her last book, but the book before. I'm not knocking her last book, but the book before, which is called How the South Won the Civil War. This is a chilling fact of American history, is that we never resolved the Civil War, actually, right? And we, the people of the United States, allowed the most treasonous, seditious rebels in American history to resume positions of power, influence, and wealth. And we are seeing the legacy of that failure dividing our country today. The working title of my book on James Baldwin is This Division in Our House, James Baldwin and the Myth of America. The title comes from his own phrase, this division in our house, obviously echoing Lincoln's warning that a house divided cannot stand. right? We have a grave division in the country, and it is no longer a sectional division as it was leading into the Civil War. The urban-rural divide is a major aspect of this division, but it's a division that also doesn't fall neatly on partisan lines, although partisanship is so extreme right now. It's a division over willingness to reckon with the past, to acknowledge and reckon with the past, right? So as you might remember, in 2017, there was a white nationalist event in Charlottesville, Virginia, right? And President Trump asked about it afterwards, said, well, there were very fine people on both sides, meaning full-on neo-Nazi white supremacists qualified as very fine people for that president, right? And afterward, his chief of staff, General John Kelly, said, if only Americans had compromised, we could have avoided the Civil War. That's not true, okay? I am here to tell you that historians have studied the Civil War a lot, okay? And historians who don't agree on much agree on this. The Civil War was inevitable because the path to the Civil War was put in place when the Constitution was created, right? When this fundamental, what's that word? Conflict between democracy and slavery, and then later democracy and different classes for people, right? Ideas that we're not equal. Some people are down and deserve to be down. This conflict continues. And so when we're looking at this election of 2024, we're looking at the most stark ideological difference that we've seen since the eve of the Civil War, right? So on the Harris side, we have a commitment to Americanism. This idea that democracy is the right form of government, that we all share equality in rights and ought to share equality of opportunity, right? And that our liberty should be protected by the government rather than infringed, right? So that Americanism on the one side. And then on the other side, we actually have a blood and soil nationalism that is so disturbingly echoing actual Nazi rhetoric, saying some people have a stake in this country based on their ancestry, right? And demonizing immigrants to such a horrific degree as we're seeing in Springfield right now, right? To such a, that honest, hardworking, law-abiding people are subject to terrible threats of violence, okay? So the stakes are high, and I hope that my knowledge of the past can help inform where we are today.
Thank you, Amy. David, on the science of elections.
All right. I've got this fancy word up there, which I try to build with my students and try to build in the Big Ollie class this morning. And that is this idea of becoming a psephologist. All right, that's that cool Greek word that's up there. Your job this season, because it is so stark and there is so much at stake, because it's 1860, but also 1968 and 1964, and every other fancy election that you can think of, all rolled into one. That's what's at stake this election. Your job is to set all of the noise aside and become an elections forecaster. That's the psephologist, all right? That's your job. So that means we have to look at certain things and pay attention to certain components. And we have to, unfortunately, set aside political science, because the political science literature argues that A, debates don't matter. Just ask Joe Biden. The political science argues that campaigns themselves don't matter. Just ask any candidate. Political science argues that campaign money and finance doesn't matter. Try to explain that to those of you that give money or participate in politics. It tries to explain that a vice presidential selection doesn't matter. Try to explain that on October 1st, the last debate that we're going to have. So the political science gets it wrong every single time. And that's the joy of what I do. I teach students how to be wrong, and my job is to teach you how to get past the noise so that we're not wrong. Because this election and the mathematical models that I run don't end on November 5th. They continue in the contingent election process as part of the Constitution. And that moves through November into December, can move into January, February, and March. That's the nightmare scenario. That's unlikely, but a possibility that's put forth in our Constitution. This document riddled with contradictions and dilemmas that Kit just spoke of. As a result, we have to get past the noise and really use our expertise that it doesn't taste great, less filling. That's not what we're talking about. It's not a flip of a coin, that there are things we can see. So if you look at places like all of you go to in the morning when you look at Nate Silver and see what he's put forward, for example, he takes a whole bunch of polls and creates a mathematical average. And the mathematical average of a whole bunch of icky things is still icky. And that's why you get a lot of noise, which means Donald Trump's number is underreported. That's the base. So I can answer your question before you even ask. If you look at the election today, she has to be ahead by 5 points in swing state likely voter polls to have a shot because of something called gender and racial bias. And she's got both of those in this election. All right. So that means you look at states like Pennsylvania and you look specifically at Erie County or Northampton County. That's what we do when we take a deep dive. And I have some of my students here from my elections course, and they are rock stars because they know how to do this and they actually know what Taylor Swift's impact is. And they can explain it to all of us, and it's substantial. And I can finally say, as a political science professor at a university, that the folks that are going to save us are 18 to 34-year-olds. And that's phenomenal. But if you look at this fundamentally in the science, you have to look at the data and set aside your preferences. And I do that in a really hard clinical way. And that means that there are certain things we can look at. Can we go to like this kind of last slide here? We look at things like this, right? This is that Nate Silver kind of slide that you see. And there's a lot of things missing in this forecast. It's not state by state. It's not county by county. And it doesn't really take a deep dive, because what we're interested in is how changing demographics are altering the structure of the country. And the electorate is overwhelmingly still white, but it's fundamentally changing in dramatic ways. And that's what you're seeing as the battle of the future of America. So we can join those trends that we're seeing in economics. We can join those trends that we're seeing demographically and sociologically. We can look at those things, put them into the politics, consider our history, and become a psephologist. And the great thing is it's interdisciplinary in nature, because the political science gets it wrong over and over and over again. And if you work in politics, you know that. But it is hugely helpful in terms of forecasting in a direction. So our job, I think, here is to be public about what we do to help you understand the noise that's coming forward for the next 50 to 100 days. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So folks, what we're going to do now, based on your presentations, we're actually going to go through some questions that came in and that we had talked about previously. So the first one's for Emily. What are some of the benefits and concerns with funding lunar or Martian colonization?
Sure. So some of the benefits include being able to have access to, studying outer space from the vantage point that's necessary to learn about the deep history of the universe. To be able to establish more sensors and data collection technology to better understand our conditions on Earth through climate change. But there's a lot to consider here because what does it mean to take human beings and establish quote unquote colonies on celestial bodies? First, we have to consider again that 1967 treaty, and I keep bringing it up because that is a treaty that is slowly being eroded by the commercialization of outer space. And this growing competition to have access to resources in outer space, like mineable, extractable resources in outer space. And so that's going to present an enormous challenge because that is a competitive environment that is bounded by treaty and policy that is meant to require us to work complementary with other countries, that no country, whether you're spacefaring or not, can have a monopoly or access to those commercial possibilities in outer space. Yet countries like the US, and not just the US, are ramping up the contracts they give to defense contractors and military development that also makes those same technologies that could become part of the extractive industries in outer space. Then we also have questions about how do you establish populations? Who are making these decisions? some of the questions that Kit raised are the same kinds of questions about how do we make decisions? We are living in an incredibly unjust place in the present tense. So who gets to go, who doesn't? We don't have very good answers or ideas from the space entrepreneurs. So it becomes a democratic public question, and yet it's usually confined as a bureaucratic set of questions or expert-driven questions, and we don't really answer them as a public. So that's my concern.
And Emily, something that came in from the attendees is how you frame it. It seems like space politics is actually pretty consequential in terms of where we're headed. Why don't we hear the candidates talk about it more, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I'd love to ask them that also. But I think part of the reason candidates don't talk about it is a lot of people are not single issue voting or staking much of their vote on space policy. And I think one of the reasons people don't put a lot of emphasis on space policy is it's sort of occluded from view, or NASA has kind of a very friendly or cute public face. A lot of like children's engagement or kind of fun countdowns for touchdowns and like, rovers and things like that, which is all great for public outreach. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but it really doesn't reveal the politics that's involved in making decisions about outer space. So it seems almost exclusively the purview of engineers and scientists and bureaucrats. And if we dig around my corner of political theory, that's precisely where we need to look to find our relationships of power and decision making, is in what appears to be quotidian, everyday, or something that everyday people don't have a stake in because we couldn't possibly understand. And while it's true, I'm no physicist, astro or otherwise, and I think calculating a tip is about where I max out on doing math, I can tell you something, and so can you tell us all something about what the stakes are of making population scale decisions about how we live, especially on a climatically changing planet, which is one of the reasons this has become so important. And so there's also not a link between space policy and other issues that are vital and taking up a lot of our conversational space, as they should be.
Thank you for that. So this next question for Amy. Amy, in the last 250 years of presidential elections, which are the most relevant for us as sort of frames of reference, thinking about the one we're presently in?
Like Dave said, this one does have quite a few rolled up into one. And I want to talk about those. But first, on precedent, I just want to move a little bit to the side of elections to say something about Donald Trump, who is, we say, unprecedented, norm-breaking. That's all true. However, there is a relevant precedent for Donald Trump, and that is President Andrew Jackson. And I just want to speak about Jackson briefly before getting into elections again, because there's a reason that Donald Trump had a portrait of Jackson, right, in the Oval Office. Not that Trump knows anything, really, but somehow he got the vibe. Right. And so this is early in the history of American partisanship. OK, partisanship, which is bad for the country. There's a reason George Washington warned against factions, but they were already there. Right. But it's not until you get the modern Democratic Party, the oldest political party in the world in terms of its continuous institutional coherence, right? That you get the kind of polarity that is so characteristic today, right? So that Democratic Party, the party of Jackson, the party of the so-called common man, that common man was white, okay? And the removal of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, right, from Southeast United States, and their removal, their forced march that we know as the Trail of Tears, was illegal. You see, Congress had passed a law. Supreme Court struck down the law. Jackson said, go ahead, right? We're still going to do it. So why didn't Jackson get impeached? Well, because he was a Democrat and he had a Democrat Congress, right? And the power of impeachment is in Congress. And so if they like what he did, they were not going to impeach him. So I just want to point that out. That is also why Donald Trump got impeached by the Democrats, but the Republicans stood by him. And so one of the things that's so chilling now is to see that a once great Republican Party that had the integrity to tell Richard Nixon it was time for him to resign no longer has that level of integrity. The leaders of the party who spoke to Nixon then have left the party now. So that's just a comment, not about elections per se, but about presidential precedent. Okay. And so I briefly said about 1816. I don't want to dwell on it too much. Lincoln was not on the ballot in the soon-to-be Confederate States. There are places in which Harris may as well not be on the ballot, and there are places in which Trump may as well not be on the ballot. The difference is, of course, we've got this checkerboard now, rather than the strict sectionalism of that time. And the Civil War wouldn't look quite the same, right? If that's what busts out after this election, right? It will be actually much more mayhem, involving much more civilian casualties. So that 1968 is relevant, especially relevant because, of course, LBJ, a one-term president, chose not to run for re-election, which threw it up in the air. We have political assassination here. We've had assassination attempts. In that case, it was also the vice president who then unsuccessfully ran for president. But Hubert Humphrey was or I should say, Kamala Harris is no Hubert Humphrey, right? She has much more dynamism, much more integrity, she's much more in touch with the electorate. So that is a difference. So I want to just mention one more election for us to think about, and that is the election of 1912. Okay, so this is Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, bringing the Democratic Party into the modern era, right? This is really, he's going to have the first modern presidency in terms of holding press conferences, considering himself responsible for shaping the direction of legislative initiatives, for working with Congress in this sort of unified party way, okay? But he was not that different ideologically from Teddy Roosevelt, who was heading the progressive ticket. And their engagement during the election season was substantive. It actually got Americans thinking about what is the proper role of government. And that is a question that is very much before us today. Is it the proper role of government to use the military to round up immigrants and deport them? One side says yes. The other side says we need to follow the rule of law.
Thank you. David, because I know you look a lot at the polls, a question came in and it's kind of similar to what we were going to talk about anyway. What are some similarities with the polls in 2020 that one could maybe draw inference from with respect to what we're seeing today, if at all? And if not, why not?
All right. So the polling in 2016, as you all know, underestimated the support for candidate Trump. It was similar, but not exactly the same level in 2020, meaning we got better at the polling. The polling does underestimate this time, but not as substantial, because we've done two things. One is when we develop likely voter models and likely voter polls. Likely voter polls today, you have to answer affirmatively on 8 out of 10 questions or affirmatively on 12 out of 15. It depends the metric in which you're trying to design the likely voter. We didn't do that in 20, and we didn't do that in 2016. In 2016, that was quite costly. In terms of measurement, our model showed that about 1 in 3 college-educated white women would vote for Donald Trump, and the final number was about 46%, just a shade under 46%. It's a big error mathematically. It's not error, it's worthlessness, is what that is. So we have to take into account, now we're doing a better job of calculating who the likely voter is. And we're seeing this, we're also surveying better numbers. So then the question would rise, all right, what polls should you pay attention to? What should you look for? Many of you read the Times, and the New York Times is always put forth as like a great polling operation. The polling operation that they had about 7 or 8 weeks ago with that swing state poll that showed her way ahead by 5 to 8 points had a 41% likely voter model for Donald Trump voters from 2020, 41%, which they underestimated Donald Trump voters in the poll, which means what would it show? She's ahead. And that's exactly what happened. They corrected that with their poll about 2 weeks ago, and they over-surveyed Trump voters and under-surveyed Biden 2020 voters. And guess what it showed? Oh, the opposite. This is the New York Times, for God's sakes. All right, big deal. So they're always held up as a viable poll, a strong poll. Take it easy with that. The Marquette Law School poll, you see the Marquette Law School poll that's run by Charles Franklin, a political scientist. I had him as a professor at Big Blue for a couple of summers. He was at Madison, Wisconsin. The Marquette Law School poll is the bomb. That is a very well done poll. It is And it does things like it looks at, remember the double haters that we had a few weeks ago? And in the audience, some of you know them as Reagan Democrats or security moms or NASCAR dads or whatever the media invents that particular election. Charles tries to grab that particular voter, the disaffected Trump voter. They're not thrilled with voting with him, and they're not going to go to Kamala. So what do? He tries to go after that demographic using advanced techniques. So the Marquette Law School poll is very well done. Gary Langer, Langer, used to be the pollster at ABC, which ABC News, they do the polls with the Washington Post. Gary Langer's father was a Stanford prof. Gary Langer is no longer doing the ABC News WAPO poll, but he trained everybody who's there. And the WAPO polls, the Washington Post polls that come out are very helpful. Not quite, I would say, as great as the Marquette, but they're like 1 and 2, A and B, if that's where you're looking for polls to follow as well. They do a good job with the underreported Trump component, and they do an excellent job with trying to create a likely voter universe for what's happening. Because as an example, the fastest growing Asian American population in the United States is in Georgia. So they're concentrating on what's happening in Georgia as an example. And you all know how important Georgia and Pennsylvania are. So that's how they're those two pollsters are diving into the demographic change that's happening in those areas.
So David, as a follow-up to that, how is the younger voter? We had a couple questions come in that are relatively related to each other about younger voters, let's say 18 to 34-year-old. How do pollsters, well, that's probably too complex for this stag. How do 18 to 34-year-olds play out in terms of the modeling?
Okay, so notice first that we measure, whether we're here or at Harvard, that we measure 18 to 34-year-olds as one block. Any problem with that? Like there's a big difference between an 18-year-old and a 24-year-old and a 34-year-old, right? When we measure them as one block. So the way we've dealt with that is try to measure them as 18 to 29, really 18 to 24. 18 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, kind of in 10-year blocks. Because we're trying to grab something here, and I'll use Taylor Swift as an example. Taylor Swift, let's see, Miles, I'm trying to remember, in 2006, was that when she was like first famous? 2006, she's 16 years old. So how old is that 16-year-old today?
34.
34. Got it? Right? And maybe she's 34 to 39. Maybe she's a mother. And she's listening to Taylor Swift, and so's her daughter. Very different, very, very different demographics there. So we have to carve up the demographic that way, because here's what we've seen in Pennsylvania. After the announcement, the next few days, the reported VBMs, the requests for vote by mail, goes way up, way up. And it goes way up with 18 to 34-year-olds. But what do 18 to 34-year-olds not do at a high rate? The one thing that matters, vote. And so expressing outrage, doing what you do online, grabbing the VBM is not the same thing as getting the registration and actually filling out the ballot. That's the difference. But unfortunately, events do alter their participation. Parkland, Florida, mass shooting, 2018, kicks up. Dobbs decision, 2022, another midterm, kicks up. But what we're talking about is a doubling from like 8 to 10% to like 16 to 20%. And that flips districts, especially down ballot, especially for House and Senate races, especially for local races, even though it's a very tiny number. And I will say, to our credit, this is not political science or history or econ, that Sonoma State is one of the highest participating campuses in the nation, held for our size in the country for what our students do. And that's because it's a whole of campus effort for what we do.
Yeah, 2 years ago, our voting drive here was held in high regard throughout the CSU system. I want to say it was the top of the 23 campuses.
I think it was the top.
Yeah.
And we typically are in like the top 10% for campuses our size nationwide in terms of what's going on and how Circle mentions it in Tufts. So we give a lot of emphasis to this 18 to 34, but really kind of cutting it as 18 to 24, 25 to 34 because of the examples that I just laid out.
So folks, what we're going to do now is we're going to shift a little bit down ballot in the sense of what I want to ask all three of you is from your viewpoint as a researcher, what are some of the down ballot issues that we should be seeing as maybe having national significance? Is it a senatorial race? Is it some measure somewhere that might be the beginning of something that's more of a broad national movement? So the question is there a down ballot issue in your viewpoint that you're watching that suggests that something big is going to happen or may have consequential aspects after it's done? For example, a senatorial race that might flip Congress, or if it flips, in what way does that change the dynamic of what happens after November 5 from the president on down? David, and we'll walk back toward Emily.
Okay, two things. Democrats right now don't believe they'll win Montana and hold Montana with John Tester. Abortion is on the ballot in that state, but they think it's too hard to hold that state. Now, abortion rights in Montana is a function of libertarianism. It's not a function of being a Democrat or being a liberal. So it functions there a little bit differently. If, however, Democrats hold the Tester seat, it gives them an almost 9 in 10 chance of holding the Senate at 50 votes. So it's the whole enchilada for Chuck Schumer in that regard. So you have to pay attention to that. The other is what's happening in Nebraska. That would be Don Bacon's district. This would be Nebraska 2. You might recall that Kamala Harris and the Harris campaign pledged to spend $25 million down ballot. I think it was last week or the week before. It was the day after the tragic shooting outside of what happened in Atlanta. Of that $25 million, they pledged $8 million to Nebraska 2. A third of that money. Only $9 million has been spent by Democrats in Nebraska 2 in the last 2 years. Then they pledged yesterday to double that number in Nebraska 2, because Nebraska splits its electoral college votes. 4 electoral college votes, you pick up 1 electoral college vote. So let me explain this to you mathematically. If they win Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan.
Oh, David, who's they? Who's they?
The Harris campaign. If they win Pennsylvania, they win Michigan and then Wisconsin, and they pick up 1 electoral vote, they are over 270. 1. Guess where that one is? Omaha, Nebraska, where the #1 issue is guns and gun violence. So what's happening in Nebraska 2 and what's happening in Montana are hugely important. Let me just add one more thing real quickly. People always ask, where should I send my money? What should I do? You send your money to the place where it's the cheapest media market in that state. And I can do this for both Democrats and Republicans. So you send your money where the bang for the buck is greatest. Guess where it's greatest for the bang for the buck for House seats in the whole country? Nebraska 2. So there should be a deluge in Don Bacon in that district in Omaha. And in California, that would be 13 and 22. That would be Valadeo's district. Let's see, 13 and 22. Those 2 congressional districts would be key. Mary Patola in Alaska would be key in terms of bang for the buck. So you can go through and do this. Michigan 8 is an open seat. That's the bang for the buck. So we can look at this all over, and part of it, because you have to think about the media markets. So that's another thing that we'll do, is we'll look at the media markets and explain where the bang for the buck is greatest, because that's where your money goes the furthest. You spend lots of money, or the analogy I use as a college professor, you drink, you drink, Lagunitas, Russian River, and then you go to the party. You all went to college. You go to the party and you switch to Jack or Cuervo, and guess what happens? The yak effect, diminishing marginal utility.
There you go.
You have to spend enough money to the point, and that's one of the values we bring, is spending enough money to a point and then stop spending more money. Thanks.
Got it. Amy.
It's so great talking after the election expert when I'm really not one.
Well, what other races are you thinking about as a historian as potentially having historic significance other than the presidential election?
Right. Well, so Sherrod Brown's attempt to defend his Senate seat in Ohio seems important to me. And that's not only because I grew up in Ohio. I grew up in Ohio, understanding Ohio to be representative of the nation because of its particular demographic representativeness. I drank some kind of soda, now I forget the name of it, that was only test marketed in Columbus, Ohio. It didn't succeed. It was very bad. And it used to be, as Ohio goes in the presidential election, so goes the nation. But things have changed. Nevertheless, this seems really important. And he's running against Bernie Moreno with I mean, I think Brown has an intelligent way of representing this problem we have. JD Vance has the same problem, not representing all Ohioans, not even pledging to govern for the whole. So let's see how that one goes.
Thank you. Emily.
I'm more of an issue watcher than a specific race watcher. So I will also punt all the good discussion to my colleague, Dr. McEwen. And I will just say that of the races I am interested in, I really am curious about the Silicon Valley races, in part because Silicon Valley, we'll call them politicians, but a lot of people transition out of being what you would call like a tech entrepreneur into politics. And they hold some pretty radical views. So there is a really big, not big, but it's growing movement that's pretty anti-democratic. It's called the kind of anti-enlightenment movement. It rejects a lot of the ideals from the Enlightenment period. And part of that is embracing forms of fascism. And there are some pretty notable people that come out of this. Peter Thiel, for example, is a really well-known figure in Silicon Valley who holds these views and also dumps a tremendous amount of money into electoral politics, both state and federally. Spends a lot on the Trump campaign, for example. So I'm watching to see who is percolating up through the elections in Silicon Valley, because some of them would actually like to deconstruct the country from the inside out and rebrand us as a corporation. And it should be a corporation that is a form of neo-feudalism that rejects democracy and rejects Enlightenment principles. Not to say we can't discuss where the Enlightenment has brought us and that we should have robust conversations, but I think we sometimes imagine this is so marginal. These are small voices, maybe with a lot of money, it doesn't matter, but I think it matters greatly. It's so easy to imagine some of those fringe positions are just that, but fringe is not only very much the center, but that is imagining that we can keep at arm's distance positions that we find really dangerous, and we cannot. And so paying closer attention to those voices and where their money goes, I think, is valuable.
Thank you. And so, Emily, sticking with you, we had a question come in that was, how do you see the global conflicts and the assassination attempts against President Trump as being consequential or not in the election from your viewpoint, knowing history and kind of thinking forward?
Me?
Yes, just start with this for all y'all.
Okay. You think I know these things? Okay. Well, I mean, it's historical in the sense we don't have a lot of assassination attempts in U.S. electoral politics. I think it's important in part because the people who have been identified as the people who are involved in assassination are not coming from the left. It seems to be that it's coming, the call's coming from inside the house, sort of thing with the right. And so I think it might tell us something about how splintered and fractured not just our party system is, but people are not exactly sure where to land in their tremendous dissatisfaction. And some of that dissatisfaction are issues that the candidates are not discussing or they're changing their mind about. One day they're in favor of the Green New Deal, the next day they're supporting fracking. And that is a Harris position that we should be paying attention to. So it has significance, but I also want to think it's important to contextualize it in other global political movements, because we're not paying very much attention to the growing far right in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe. And so imagining this as just kind of America's new problem, I think reinforces a little American exceptionalism and as the only political theater that matters. And other countries have also had a history of volatile elections, and perhaps we could learn about democratic approaches to managing volatile elections, not just from US examples.
Thank you. Amy.
I really appreciate your pushing us to think in a more cosmopolitan and global way. And I think that's really important. And I also share your distaste for American exceptionalism overall. However, on this one issue, we really are exceptional because we are exceptionally awash in guns, right? And so the question is, will this get us any closer to some reasonable gun control measures? Will we start protecting our children if not our presidential candidates, right, by actually regulating firearms. And it's so striking, as Emily said, we haven't had that many assassination attempts for a country that has actually been gun obsessed for a while. But what we are seeing is the fruit of the radicalization and politicization of the NRA. The NRA really used to be a rifle club where you would just shoot at targets and be ready to join the militia if they called you up, right? But it became a major political force just in the last 50 years, and firmly, again, partisan. And so what's so astonishing is we've had these assassination attempts, which ought to shock the conscience. Just like every school shooting ought to just really rock us. And instead, instantly, using it as political fodder. The triumphant mood at the Republican convention was a fruit of this assassination attempt, rather than sobriety, self-examination, really reckoning with who we want to be as a nation.
And on top of that, though, if you think about the global conflicts, not they're related per se, but if you think about what's happening in Gaza and you think about what's happening in Ukraine, historically speaking, are we at a kind of a weird time in terms of the American political election process being what it is, at the same time that there's relatively large conflicts and a lot of uncertainty about those spaces parallel?
Absolutely. And especially, it used to be that foreign policy wasn't partisan in the same way as domestic politics, right? And now it is. And we have a party who would let Ukraine get gobbled up by Russia and would allow like unlimited slaughter of Palestinians for the sake of a triumphant Israeli state. So we are so intertwined with these global politics in the stakes of this election. Yeah,
David,
How sober do you want this to be?
I need it to happen in 1 minute.
Okay. Foreign policy is, not in the top 5 of issues for most voters. It is the economy, the pocketbook. It's immigration. It's bringing the nation together, whatever that means. It is abortion, and then usually global climate change. Foreign policy comes after that, which is hugely important. But there are some important implications here. We talk about China, but the reality is it doesn't appear the United States could stop a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. What we need are the chips. So the Chinese and the good US government, the CIA knows this. They can take it over in 96 hours to 120 hours. And then they agree to sell us the chips. That keeps the US economy going. The Dow returns from its 25% plummet as a result of that. And within a month, the Chinese have Taiwan. And there's not a lot we can do about that. The reality and sobriety of that is that it's not a new American century. It's not American exceptionalism. It's a new world order that's much more balanced, but also has us in a place that we've never been before. That type of strategic thinking, neither party and neither candidate is doing. And that is hugely problematic for the future of our economy and where we're going as the shining example of the city on a hill.
So if you are not now going to sleep tonight, there's plenty of coffee and cookies back there to kind of spur you on till morning.
You're welcome.
No, it's okay, David. I know you kind of warned it was going to be, a little weird when you answered. That's okay. Let's end on a maybe positive note, in sense we had a question come in that is, what advice would you give to students about getting engaged and being more aware of what's going on politically and potentially its place in history?
Get off social media.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, not necessarily that you have to get off social media. I'm on social media. I like social media. Okay. I have nicely curated feeds, but it's not political action. And so what Dave was saying earlier about how college students like to act like they care a lot about politics, but forget to vote, right? If instead you could get involved in politics in all sorts of other ways, which could be as simple as calling people in Pennsylvania and talking to them about the election, writing postcards, right? Forming groups, joining existing groups. Participatory democracy is a term that was used in the Port Huron statements of the Students for Democratic Society way back in the early 1960s. That term comes from the philosopher John Dewey, who said, voting is the least you can do, the least you can do. Right. So, I mean, this is such a great question. And I have to say, students are my hope. I get very down. I have trouble sleeping. I think of our students. I think of my earnest, bright, just energetic students. And I feel like, okay, well, maybe they're going to save us. So please do.
David. Thank you.
I have no trouble sleeping. I want to say that this is actually a very hopeful time. Politics matters, which is way cool from our perspective. That means education matters. That means we have to embrace being out there in public, even for uncomfortable subjects like Gaza, even for uncomfortable situations and discussions about setting forth the priorities of this country based on some people want to control their bodies or security or whatever it is. The embrace of the political is very exciting, and our students, and I see this with young people, they're engaged. And I'm not afraid of social media because the problem is you have to win to govern. And if you're going to worry about what the process is and the group therapy of how we get there, which many people are very good about, the Democrats want to have a group therapy session about what's going to happen. That means you're not going to win. And Republicans know how to win, and then they deal with the family fight. So it's about getting over the family fight to win and decide what kind of country you want, then have the therapy session.
Emily.
I'll be fast.
No worries.
To tell students, I share your enthusiasm. Don't let anybody tell you you aren't ready to be in politics or you don't know enough. Even though I am a political science professor, I do not think you need to have taken a single class to have a stake in politics or understand how politics matters to you. So get and stay involved. To echo Kit, that politics is not just an election and voting. You should, but politics is far broader and more expansive than that. Don't be afraid to start running for elections. Go show up locally. Hold your elected officials accountable. Not only does your voice matter, but they're beginning to recognize your voice matters too, because you are the next big voting bloc, and it's more than voting. And there's a rich history in the US of doing more than voting. And that's really important. And remember, we live intergenerationally. And so we're setting the table for each other up and down the generational scale. And so keeping in mind how interconnected we are with each other, I think will make our politics richer.
Thank you, folks. Before we end, I had one more question that came up, and as the moderator, I'm going to take a privilege here. This is the Fed just lowered the rate by 0.5% and indicated they're looking to do more. How does that impact the election? As an economist, I would say that it is not going to impact this election. What it may do and what it portends as what's coming for the economy is affect the next one. So watch for that. People are not going to go scream into the polls saying, okay, now my rates are lower, I'm now going to vote one way or the other. They will watch the shape of the economy and think about it the next time. Folks, thank you so much for coming tonight. I want to thank the Alumni Association and Advancement for being our key partners on campus on this event and things to come. Our sponsors, our panelists, especially, thank you. Big round of applause for our panelists and our experts tonight. And thank you all for making the time to come and hear this discussion, and hopefully you walk away thinking a little bit differently about the elections and many to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.